What are some important developments which contributed to the development of ideas of liberty within the Western tradition? It is important to note that not every single development led to new ideas of liberty. In fact, even what may seem as the opposite may be true. For example, in Peter Ackroyd's work Civil War, he discusses the ideas of Hobbes based in the context of civil war which had engulfed England at the time. Hobbes thought that stripped of order and security, men are at enmity one with another in a perpetual contention for honor, riches, and authority. A form of contract might be agreed whereby each man is contented with so much liberty against other men as he would allow other men against himself. The instinct for self-preservation is a key element of Hobbes' metaphysics, as the very foundation of his theory of state. The contract between men is the beginning of wisdom. This would be maintained by a common power set over them both, with right and force sufficient to compel performance. It must be an authority, enforce the contract in perpetuity. Supreme authority demands supreme power. Thus, there would be a living absolutism, the great Leviathan. It would impose the religion of the state, and there would be no such thing as liberty of conscience. Justice is simply what the law demands. He was subsequently denounced as an atheist and a materialist. We can also see how said developments advancing the cause of liberty may in fact possibly signify a break in said tradition. However, in other terms, it may also be considered a possible extension of it. It may thus be simultaneously considered an extension of said tradition and a break from it. Thus, whilst the American political project may be considered a kind of breakaway from the British political tradition in certain important aspects, it may be considered an extension of it, or of the broader Western tradition. Thus, you may consider it as a breakaway by abstracting certain political ideals as ends in themselves, rather as then developments stemming from a tradition, based within the context of the British peoples and their history, and undermining or having a kind of fundamental conflict with the key tenets of it, such as the institution of monarchy, albeit in a constitutional form. At the same time, the American project is very much the logical extension of certain developments within the British and broader Western traditions. Self-evidently, the United States is building upon the liberal project, itself an extension of the Enlightenment project. As the Enlightenment project comes increasingly under attack, as Davies asserts, see Napier Press published sociology textbooks, the foundation of the American project comes increasingly under attack as well. Interestingly, our current post-World War II era of inclusive diversity and the liberal consensus order is coming to an end. What may replace it may be an anti-liberal, even anti-enlightenment force. Indeed, the advent of the internet has led to an information revolution, as mentioned by Heather Wright, as part of the postmodern worldview, alongside individuality without belonging. See the work Future Church by Peter Brearley. But has then also given rise to, amongst various other philosophies and factions, the online right, who have been inspired in part by, for example, the Dark Enlightenment. You can see the rise of alternative facts, quote unquote, of an increasingly fragmented and polarized discourse, of a kind of hyper-reality, where everything is a 4D abstraction, a kind of simulacra for the real thing, in reference to Baudrillard. What we are perhaps experiencing is the phenomena of the digital town square, where online voices gather to see or share different ideas and views. See my video on this topic. It is a return to a kind of oral culture, where hearsay, tales, and anecdotes carry weight as well. Do we have a rise in abstract thought as well? The information revolution has created an incredible diversity in viewpoints and perspectives, of nuanced and various perspectives, in fact, of new intellectual developments and advancements. And yet, this access to an unlimited amount of information has also created the conditions for nihilism, for an incredible degree of uncertainty, of existential angst and crisis. For, given the unlimited amount of information available to us, the human mind, the human senses, testimony, indeed any path and route to knowledge is fallible and limited, insofar as humans are fallible beings, not insofar as to whether or not there is an objective reality. Indeed, we are bound by our own subconscious biases, our own interpretive lens, referring to P.F. Young's video expanding upon Jordan Peterson's ideas of the subject. As such, the incredible amount of information, perspectives, and opinions undermines certainty, leading to a collapse of faith in or adherence to meta-narratives, or ideologies, or systems of thought which assert a claim to truth. And yet, sowed within this are the very seeds by which tradition, or some semblance of it, may be restored. For in fragmented discourse, a discourse of no unifying nature, one where there are any number of facts, pieces of information, or viewpoints and opinions on offer, people will default back onto identity. This creates the intellectually militaristic conditions of emotional personal discourse. And yet, within this are the very seeds of contradiction, the seeds of destruction, for the very intellectual tools provided facilitate the very attitudes set to undermine those views. Thus, a dialectical struggle now forms between the proliferation of information and viewpoints and the struggle against it, as people default back onto their identities, emotions, and own personal views so as to maintain some kind of worldview. The latter by nature is exclusionary, intolerant to the out-group of ideas, sympathetic to the in-group of ideas. Each and every group thus engages in a conflict of discourse and ideas by the very tools which continually undermine said conflict. This contradiction is further emphasized by the attempts at censorship in the online sphere by certain corporations, despite these being ultimately futile to the nature of the internet to allow for dissemination of knowledge and viewpoints in a decentralized manner, and this can also be extended to certain governments and regimes as well. Thus, with the ever-increasing attempts to centralize the spread of information and silence certain views, this contradiction intensifies. We further see how echo chambers enforcing certain narratives intensifies this contradiction. Despite the endless amount of facts and viewpoints, each individual is further shown that which appeals to him specifically, further intensifying this contradiction. This dialectical process, this contradiction which pushes forward online dialogue, which, if we are to believe Baudrillard, may have become a kind of hyper-reality, perhaps even more real for vast swathes of humanity than reality itself, it sows the seeds of destruction for the very form of organization of these ideas and their proliferation, the tools of which precisely create the conditions for this discussion. This may draw inspiration by the ideas of Marx and Hegel, see the Penguin Classics edition of the Communist Manifesto, introduction by Gareth Stedman Jones. Thus, the ever-enlarging number of ideas, the ever-increasing exposure to facts, the ever-expanding nature of discourse creates the conditions for the restoration of identity-based tradition. As the author of humanity becomes uncertain, as man's consciousness seems to lead him down a road of further and further uncertainty, so he now returns to be grounded in the is. His very ought to be grounded in his very is. What is right deemed so by the very nature of it being so. The context-bound and context-based. See Imperium Press's Substack for more ideas of this kind. Truth, now being grounded in the is, defaults upon the essence of reality in and of itself, in its very essence which its historical manifestations and derived social constructs are deconstructed and dissolved. From the Islamic and broader theistic perspective, we default back onto the first, necessary being, the divine who is the origin of all existence and being. For others, they may view it as the material reality in and of itself, which is real by its very being, for there is no meaning for some kind of abstract transcendental existence. For example, see Baron de Holbach's Systems of Nature or Imperium Press's Substack. Others may assert an underlying, real idealistic nature to reality, whereby the material reality is merely imperfect imitations of abstract and unchanging ideas, such as the idealism of Plato. And yet, regardless, man now defaults back onto the essence of reality, after the deconstruction of the social constructions based on said reality, and hence the reconstruction now takes place. Man now defaults back onto that which within which he is context-bound, context-based, and hence the organic basis for his or her identity. In other words, he identifies in terms of his blood, his lineage, his tribe, yet simultaneously he identifies with the transcendental, the divine, tradition, civilization, and nation. It is now this, after the seeds of destruction were sown by the very tools of a modern, late modern, even indeed postmodern world, that now humankind reverts back to this. and yet man is bound between his identity as part of a species sharing one genus and man as part of many different groups and tribes. The dialectical process means that the fundamental contradiction and thus conflict between exclusionary and inclusionary, unifying and particularizing, globalizing and regionalizing identities are intensified. The gradual unifying forms of identity manifested over the course of history are at odds with the forces of tribalism and particularism, leading to the furthering of this dialectic over the course of history. For example, take from Yuval Noah Harari's book Sapiens, and I quote, "In time, human violence was brought under control through the development of larger social frameworks, cities, kingdoms, and states. But it took thousands of years to build such huge and effective political structures. After the agricultural revolution, human societies grew even larger and more complex, while the imagined construct sustaining the social order also became more elaborate. Empires have managed to unite diverse ethnic groups and ecological zones under a single political umbrella, thereby fusing together larger and larger segments of the human species and of planet Earth. The imperial steamroller gradually obliterated the unique characteristics of numerous peoples, such as the Numantians, forging out of them new and much larger groups. Yet one should also acknowledge this in the context of various particularizing or exclusionary forces throughout history, thus creating the conditions for this kind of dialectic. Are we heading towards a kind of one world government, or are we headed towards a multipolar world? Will these possibilities be either good or bad? A possible critique is that many universal ideas may be exclusionary in nature, yet at the same time such ideas may be assimilated and reappropriated for particularist ends. The opposite is also true, that certain, at least theoretically in essence, particularist ideas may be used for certain universalist or unifying ends. Furthermore, it is not simply a universal or particular binary at play here. There may be a wide spectrum involved, such as pan-civilizational identities but not globalist, or identities which stretch to the whole of humanity. What shall be the culmination of this dialectical process? Is it a necessary characteristic of history, or a mere possibility that has happened to manifest over history? Is this the correct way to frame this or not? Or is this one of many possible, perhaps correct ways to frame history? What shall be the culmination and trajectory of all this? Shall humanity unite after a long struggle into one common identity, or shall they disintegrate and return to the organic, the tribal, the particular? Does this characterize our period of history, or will this be an end of history kind of trajectory? Or will something else happen after this culmination, perhaps another consequence of this dialectical process, perhaps one which we can't even account for? What if this supposed endpoint isn't really the endpoint? What shall humanity do if they are united as one? Perhaps they will conquer space, or perhaps work on bringing about utopia for all, or perhaps will the dialectical process play out again, only for this global nation, quote unquote, to dissolve. If humanity were to be particularized, will they remain peaceful with one another, or will the seeds be sown for another conflict? Most likely, as has tragically been proven throughout history, exclusionary ideas lead to the dehumanization of others at times. Yet will the information revolution contribute to more humanization, to greater attempts to understand the other, or will it simply create the conditions to reinforce in-group preference and more distrust of the other? This is less to assert who is in the right or wrong, but rather to merely delineate this possible dialectical process. And so, despite all conflict and all progress, seemingly in vain, humanity trudges on through the course of history. Returning back to our topic from this tangent of mine, what may be understood from all of this? Regardless of if you agree or not, we may at least acknowledge that our liberty, or at least our exercise of it, is operationalized within the context of or based within our context-bound identity. In a postmodern condition, this theoretically would be bound by the values we choose to adopt for ourselves in an uncertain and fragmented world. However, paradoxically, as people increasingly default back onto traditional forms of identity, so that is what binds our liberty to. Our liberty is bound by our identity in many ways. Liberty within the context of and in the way in which it is contextualized by said traditions stemming from our identities, let's say. For the American, this may by nature be a kind of civic identity based in the history and political or philosophical tradition of the United States, especially from its founding fathers, despite being under attack as the Enlightenment project comes under increasing scrutiny. A further defaulting back onto a Christian, possibly pan-Western identity may be in the works here.